I want to talk about some of the common misunderstandings of headship and submission passages that sometimes seem to justify or excuse abuse. For example, during a counseling session, one of my clients said, "I've always been taught that submission to my husband trumps everything, including my children. But when my husband's raging out of control and he's screaming and he's threatening them and their scared little faces look to me for help, what am I supposed to do? Does God want me to support my husband or ignore what's happening just because he's the head of our home?" The New Testament never describes godly headship or leadership by using an authoritarian power over model. Jesus demonstrated headship for his disciples so that they would be crystal clear what he meant. But instead of wielding his mighty power and rightful authority to show them what leadership looked like, he actually donned a towel and basin, and he personally washed each of their dirty feet. They were the future leaders of his church, and Jesus wanted to show them that biblical headship meant initiating sacrificial servanthood. The scriptures nor Jesus ever describe biblical headship or leadership as entitlement to do what you want, to get what you want, or demand that other people do what you want. The correct biblical terms for those characteristics are selfishness and the misuse of one's power and authority. Now, there are a lot of examples of those behaviors throughout the scriptures, but they're never depicted as godly leadership, but rather as sin. Now, after Jesus was finished washing his disciples' feet, he said to each of them, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to also wash one another's feet, for I have given you an example, so that you should also do as I have done to you." This concept of selfless servanthood was so radically different from his disciples' idea of leadership, they truly didn't grasp what Jesus meant. Because later on, James and John were arguing about who would have a better seat in heaven when Jesus stopped them and said, "Hey guys, you know those people who are leaders and they're considered rulers of the Gentiles, and how they do it? They lord it over them. Their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shouldn't be that way among you. For whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be a slave of all." Jesus warned his leaders not to abuse their power just to get their way or to boss people around. Now, what Jesus was teaching was unheard of in Jewish culture. Hierarchy was well established even in the most intimate of relationships. Men dominated women, husbands their wives. And Paul picked up Jesus' heart on the subject of headship in marriage when he writes to husbands, "Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and sacrificially gave himself up for her." The essence of biblical teachings on headship is that if you are the leader, your responsibility is to initiate and model servanthood before anyone else in the family does. As the leader, you're to show the way. You get to go first. And so when a leader, whether in the home or a church or a nation, manipulates, threatens, and scares people into doing what he says to do or to get what he wants, know that he's not behaving as a biblical leader, but rather as a bully. Paul writes, "Husbands, love your wives, never treat them harshly." And he describes love by saying in 1 Corinthians 13, "Love does not demand its own way." But Jesus didn't only model headship for us, he's also modeling submission for us. In the Garden of Gethsemane, anticipating the crucifixion, Jesus prayed that this cup of suffering would be removed from him. He dreaded the cross. He wanted God to find an alternative way to save humankind. And yet Jesus submitted himself when he told God, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." You see, throughout his life, Jesus always described himself as wanting to do what God wanted him to do. He said his will was synonymous with God's will. But now, in this agonizing moment before the cross, in this garden prayer, Jesus felt differently. This was the first time he didn't want to do what God wanted, but he chose submission to God's will and his Father's perfect plan. Jesus submitted himself for the greater good, for the salvation of all of us. But God didn't force Jesus to submit. Jesus chose to. Jesus said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." In the same way, biblical submission can never be forced. It can only be done by the one who chooses to submit her or his will to another for a greater good. When you or I voluntarily give our will to another or to God, it's called submission. When someone forces our will to be given, it's not called biblical submission. The correct terms are intimidation, coercion, bullying. Now, submission isn't necessarily agreement. It's yielding your will to another for a greater good. It might be the good of the unity of the family or the body of Christ, or honoring and pleasing God. And Jesus modeled for us both headship and submission in volunteering for the servant's place and yielding his will to God. This describes the working together of headship and submission. The husband sacrificially leads his wife in servanthood through his example, and the wife sacrificially yields her will in servanthood through example to her husband. But both are servants of the other and of God. But only when one is the servant and the other is the master or God, the marriage isn't working as God intended. And that's happened since the fall of Adam and Eve. Human beings have been vying for power and control over one another. But this was not God's original plan. It was the result of sin. Biblical headship doesn't mean you get your way all the time. And submission doesn't mean you have no voice or no choice. The scriptures validate the mutuality of marriage and the dignity and value of each individual, no matter who they are. As Paul plainly wrote, now there is no difference between Jew and Gentile, slave and free, man or woman. We have different roles and responsibilities, but one is not over the other. Mutuality of servanthood, submission, and sacrifice are the biblical model for the Trinity and for godly relationships, including marriage. If you found this helpful, share it with a friend. Take care and God bless.